September 1894. While every settler in Haywood County, North Carolina raced to get their cabins up before winter, one Pennsylvania immigrant was still hauling fieldstone in late September. His neighbors called him the Stone Fool. They called it wasteful. Silas McReynolds spent 3 weeks building what looked like a medieval castle foundation, 18 inches high, 24 inches thick, requiring 47 tons of hand-selected stone fitted without mortar. Standard practice took 2 days maximum, just setting log sills on flat rocks. McReynolds' method took 21 days of backbreaking work. Local builder Tom Crenshaw, 30 years experience, dismissed it. "Ground don't freeze deep here like up north. Stone shelves just showing off." Then the wet seasons came. Ground-level cabins developed dampness, floor rot, termite invasions. The Great Wet Summer of 1896 brought 47 inches of rain, double normal levels. Conventional cabins faced catastrophic moisture problems, structural damage, health hazards from mold. But McReynolds' raised cabin stayed completely dry, comfortable, and healthy. Then winter 1897 hit, the worst in Appalachian memory. Temperatures dropped to 23 below zero. Neighbors' cabins became uninhabitable as foundations shifted and families evacuated. McReynolds' cabin maintained steady warmth while using 30% less firewood. What did this Pennsylvania stoneworker understand about moisture, thermal efficiency, and mountain building that generations of local wisdom had missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. The September air carried the first hint of autumn chill as Silas McReynolds hefted another fieldstone from his wagon, the 150-pound corner piece requiring both hands and a careful grip. Around him, the sounds of urgent construction echoed through the hollow, the rhythmic thunk of axes, the scrape of draw knives, the calls of men racing against time. Every other settler in Haywood County was frantically raising walls, knowing that mountain winters arrived without warning and showed no mercy to the unprepared. McReynolds set the massive stone precisely into position, checking its fit against the previous course, with the methodical patience of a man who had learned his trade under Heinrich Weber's exacting standards in Lancaster County. The German mason's voice still echoed in his memory. Der Grund muss stark sein, the foundation must be strong, or everything above it will fail. Weber had taught him that proper stonework couldn't be rushed, that each stone must find its perfect mate in the wall, and that corners bore the weight of everything that would follow. Jake Tolliver paused in his own cabin, raising to watch McReynolds work, shaking his head in disbelief. "Silas, you got rocks on the brain," he called out, earning chuckles from the other neighbors. "Man's building a fort when all he needs is a cabin. My daddy put up a house on 3 flat stones, and it stood 30 years. Tolliver's own foundation consisted of 6 limestone slabs, each roughly the size of a millstone, positioned to support his sill logs 18 inches off the ground. The entire foundation had taken him and his sons exactly 2 days to complete. Tom Crenshaw, whose reputation as the finest builder in the county stretched back 3 decades, rode up on his bay mare to inspect McReynolds' progress. The Virginian surveyed the emerging stone wall with the critical eye of a man who had housed dozens of families in these mountains. "Silas, I got to ask, what you building here? That foundation's near 2 feet thick, and you ain't even started the walls yet." He gestured toward the precisely fitted stones, each one selected and shaped to interlock with its neighbors without a single drop of mortar. "Ground don't freeze deep here like up north. Stone shelf that big is just showing off." McReynolds straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve. At 52, his Pennsylvania Dutch frame still carried the strength of his mason years, but 3 weeks of moving stones had tested even his endurance. "Ground may not freeze deep, Tom, but it sure gets wet. Seen what moisture does to wood when there's no proper barrier." He ran his hand along the top course of stones, where he had carefully shaped each piece to create a continuous shelf extending 3 feet beyond where his cabin walls would sit. "This shelf's going to shed water away from the structure, not toward it." Crenshaw dismounted and walked the perimeter of McReynolds's foundation, measuring with his practiced eye. 28 feet long, 20 feet wide, every stone fitted with the precision of a master craftsman. The base course stood 24 inches thick, tapering to 18 inches at the top, creating a platform that would lift the entire cabin 18 inches above ground level. Through stones, long pieces spanning the full width of the wall appeared every fourth course, binding the structure together with the strength that only traditional German stonework could achieve. 47 tons of stone, Crenshaw muttered, calculating the weight represented in the emerging foundation. You could have built 3 standard foundations with less work. He kicked at the carefully graded stone chips that filled the interior of the foundation, creating drainage that would channel water away rather than allowing it to pool. What's all this for? Cabin don't need to be a castle. The mockery spread through the settlement like wildfire. McReynolds became the stone fool, the Pennsylvania outsider who didn't understand mountain ways. Settlers would ride past his building site to marvel at the elaborate foundation rising stone by stone, while their own cabins already had walls up and roofs going on. Martha Hensley, whose husband had completed their cabin in record time using the traditional method of setting logs directly on stone piers, observed tartly that some folks got more time than sense. By early October, when the first frost touched the hollow, the contrast was stark. Conventional cabins stood complete and ready for winter, smoke rising from their chimneys as families settled in for the cold months ahead. McReynolds was just beginning to lay his first sill logs on the stone foundation that had consumed nearly a month of his time. His neighbors had moved on to other tasks, splitting firewood, preserving meat, preparing for the isolation that winter would bring. The technical differences were unmistakable. Standard practice called for setting hewn sill logs directly on flat stones or short piers, creating minimal elevation and maximum contact with ground moisture. The entire foundation process typically required 2 to 3 days of work and perhaps 2 tons of stone. McReynolds's approach demanded precision fitting of massive stones, careful attention to drainage patterns, and an investment of time that seemed excessive by frontier standards. Yet as October's rains began, subtle differences emerged. Conventional cabins showed the first signs of moisture infiltration as their ground-level sills absorbed water through capillary action. Tolliver noticed dampness in his corner logs where they rested on the foundation stones. Crenshaw's cabin, built with all his experience and skill, began showing the telltale signs of moisture wicking up through the wood fibers of his sill plates. McReynolds's cabin floor remained perfectly dry. The 18-inch elevation placed his living space above the moisture zone, while air circulation beneath the raised floor created natural ventilation that prevented condensation. The extended stone shelf directed rainwater away from the structure instead of allowing it to pool around the base where it could work its way into the wood. As winter approached, the stone fool's foundation stood ready, massive, permanent, and utterly impervious to the moisture that was already beginning its slow work of destruction on his neighbor's more conventional structures. The real test lay ahead, but the foundation was complete, built with the patience and precision that Heinrich Weber had demanded, and that Appalachian conditions would soon validate. The winter of 1894 arrived with Appalachia's characteristic vengeance, not the sudden, dramatic blizzards of the northern plains, but the relentless, penetrating wetness that could rot a man's bones and his cabin simultaneously. December brought the first serious test as cold rains drummed against shake roofs and turned the mountain soil into a saturated sponge that would hold moisture until spring. The seasonal pattern was predictable: 65 inches of precipitation annually, with the 4 winter months delivering 22 inches of rain combined with periodic snowmelts that kept the ground in a constant state of saturation. Jake Tolliver first noticed the problem in mid-December when he stepped onto his cabin floor and felt a subtle give in the boards near the east wall. The sensation was barely perceptible, a slight softness that hadn't been there when he'd laid the planking in September. He knelt and pressed his palm against the floor, feeling the wood yield slightly under pressure. The boards themselves were sound, good oak that he'd seasoned properly, but something underneath was changing. The issue lay in physics that frontier builders rarely considered. Tolliver's sill logs, resting directly on their stone piers, were absorbing groundwater through capillary action as surely as a wick draws oil. Wood fibers, especially in the end grain where his logs met the foundation stones, acted as thousands of tiny tubes pulling moisture upward from the saturated soil. The process was invisible but inexorable, and by January the bottom logs showed the telltale darkening that preceded structural damage. Tom Crenshaw's cabin presented a more dramatic case study. His 30 years of building experience had taught him to select the finest materials and employ the most refined techniques, but his foundation followed the same principles that had served mountain builders since the 1820s. By February, dark stains appeared along the bottom course of his logs, where they contacted the stone piers. The wood had absorbed enough moisture to support the growth of fungi that would eventually compromise the structural integrity of his entire foundation system. McReynolds observed these developments with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose preparation was proving its worth. His raised cabin remained completely unaffected by the moisture cycles that plagued his neighbors. The 18-inch gap between his floor system and the ground created what German masons called a capillary break, an airspace that prevented water from traveling upward through building materials. Stone, unlike wood, did not transmit moisture through wicking action, and the carefully fitted dry stone construction allowed any residual dampness to evaporate rather than accumulating in the structure. The thermal benefits became equally apparent as winter deepened. Conventional cabins required constant feeding of their fires to maintain livable temperatures, not only because of heat loss through walls and roofs, but because moisture in their structural members created additional cooling through evaporation. A damp log loses heat far more rapidly than a dry one, and ground-level cabins were fighting a losing battle against the physics of water transfer. McReynolds tracked his firewood consumption with the methodical precision of a man who had learned to measure everything during his Army engineering days. 6 cords lasted him through the entire winter season, while his neighbors burned 8 to 12 cords trying to maintain similar interior temperatures. The difference lay not just in superior insulation, but in the fundamental moisture control that his raised foundation provided. Tolliver's wife Martha began complaining of persistent dampness in their cabin that seemed to penetrate everything: clothing, bedding, even the dried beans stored in supposedly sealed containers. The humidity inside ground-level cabins climbed to levels that made preservation of food difficult and comfort nearly impossible. Condensation formed on the inside surfaces of walls during temperature fluctuations, creating an environment where mold and mildew thrived. The Crenshaw family faced similar challenges, despite Tom's reputation for superior craftsmanship. His cabin's interior humidity remained stubbornly high throughout the winter months, requiring constant vigilance to prevent spoilage of stored provisions. The moisture seemed to emerge from the very structure itself, as if the logs were slowly exhaling the water they had absorbed through ground contact. By March, when the seasonal thaw began, the cumulative damage was becoming visible. Tolliver's floor had developed a noticeable sag near the foundation, where moisture had softened the supporting timbers. Several of his chinking stones had worked loose as the logs shifted and settled, allowing drafts that further complicated heating efficiency. The repair work would consume valuable time during spring planting season. Crenshaw's situation was more serious. 3 of his sill logs showed advanced moisture penetration, extending 6 inches up from their contact points with the foundation stones. The wood had lost its structural integrity, developing the soft consistency that preceded complete rot. Replacement would require jacking up the entire cabin and installing new foundation members, a major undertaking that would cost both materials and labor during the crucial farming season. The economic implications were stark. Tolliver calculated that his moisture-related repairs would require $47 in materials and 12 days of labor, valued at $18 based on prevailing wage rates. Crenshaw faced even steeper costs: $23 for replacement logs plus 8 days of skilled carpentry work. McReynolds' maintenance expenses for the same period totaled exactly $0. Dr. James Caldwell, making his regular circuit through the mountain settlements, noted a correlation between housing conditions and respiratory ailments. Families in ground-level cabins showed consistently higher rates of persistent coughs, particularly among children and elderly residents. The damp conditions created ideal environments for respiratory irritants, while the constant struggle to maintain adequate heating led to indoor air quality problems. Yet most neighbors remained convinced that McReynolds's elaborate foundation represented unnecessary expense rather than superior engineering. Tom Crenshaw, even while planning extensive repairs to his own cabin, maintained that the stone fool's methods were excessive for Appalachian conditions. "One bad winter don't prove nothing," he insisted to anyone who would listen. "That fancy stonework costs more than most folks make in a season." The stage was set for a more decisive test, one that would prove whether traditional German building wisdom or established Appalachian practices would prevail when mountain conditions turned truly severe. The summer of 1896 arrived with an ominous intensity that old-timers would remember for decades. June brought unprecedented rainfall, 11 inches in a month that typically saw 4. July delivered another 13 inches, turning mountain streams into torrents and saturating the clay-heavy soil until it could absorb no more water. By August, when another 12 inches fell, the very ground seemed to weep moisture, creating conditions that would test every structural decision made by the Hollow's builders. Jake Tolliver first discovered the extent of his problem on a humid morning in late July when he stepped through his cabin floor. The oak planking, weakened by months of moisture infiltration through his foundation system, gave way under his weight with a sharp crack that echoed through the one-room structure. Beneath the broken boards, he found 3 floor joists in advanced stages of decay, their structural integrity compromised by the constant moisture wicking up from the saturated ground through his stone piers and into the wooden framework. The physics of the failure were straightforward but devastating. Ground-level foundations created direct pathways for moisture transfer from soil to structure. Tolliver's sill logs, resting on stone piers that themselves sat in increasingly waterlogged earth, had been absorbing groundwater for nearly 2 years through capillary action. The moisture traveled up through the wood fibers like water rising in a sponge, creating ideal conditions for the fungi that were slowly consuming his cabin's structural members from within. Tom Crenshaw faced even more serious damage. His reputation as the county's finest builder made the failure of his cabin a particularly bitter pill. The bottom courses of his log walls showed extensive soft rot extending 6 inches up from the foundation level. When he pressed his thumb into the affected wood, it yielded like cork, the once solid oak transformed into something resembling wet cardboard. The structural compromise threatened the integrity of his entire wall system. The termite invasion began in earnest as soil saturation reached peak levels in August. Subterranean termites, thriving in the moisture-rich environment, discovered easy access routes from earth to wood through the ground-level foundation systems. Tolliver found the first evidence when he attempted to repair his floor damage. Extensive galleries carved through his sill plates by insects that had been feeding undisturbed for months. The termite damage revealed the fundamental vulnerability of conventional building methods. Ground-level cabins provided direct contact between soil-dwelling insects and structural wood. The stone piers that supported sill logs created perfect bridges for termite colonies to access the wooden framework. Tolliver's damage assessment revealed that replacement of his foundation system would require dismantling and rebuilding nearly half his cabin. Meanwhile, Silas McReynolds observed the unfolding crisis from the comfort of his perfectly dry cabin. The raised stone foundation that had earned him ridicule 2 years earlier now demonstrated its superiority with mathematical precision. Interior humidity levels in his cabin remained at a healthy 35 to 45%, while his neighbors battled dangerous saturation levels exceeding 70%. The 18-inch gap between McReynolds' floor system and the ground provided complete protection from both moisture infiltration and insect damage. Termites could not bridge the airspace to reach his wooden structures. More importantly, the stone foundation created no pathways for capillary moisture transfer. Water simply could not travel from saturated soil into his cabin's framework through the impermeable stone barrier. Temperature measurements revealed another critical advantage of McReynolds' method. His cabin maintained interior temperatures averaging 68 degrees Fahrenheit during the humid summer months, while ground-level cabins registered 74 degrees. The difference resulted from superior moisture control. Dry structures required less energy to heat and cool, while damp buildings fought a constant battle against the thermal effects of evaporation. Dr. James Caldwell documented the health implications during his summer medical circuit. Families in moisture-compromised cabins showed dramatically higher rates of respiratory ailments. The Tolliver children developed persistent coughs that lasted through August and September. Mrs. Crenshaw suffered from what the doctor termed lung fever, likely caused by prolonged exposure to mold spores thriving in the damp conditions of their compromised cabin. The economic devastation mounted steadily. Tolliver's repair costs climbed to $63 in materials alone, not counting the value of his own labor during prime farming season. 3 replacement floor joists, new planking, and foundation repairs consumed resources that should have been invested in crop production. Crenshaw faced even steeper expenses, $87 for log replacement and structural reinforcement, plus the skilled labor required to jack up and rebuild portions of his foundation system. McReynolds's maintenance expenses for the same period remained at zero. His cabin required no repairs, no pest control measures, and no structural reinforcements. The superior performance was not accidental, but the direct result of engineering principles that German masons had refined over centuries of building in harsh continental climates. Community attitudes began shifting as the extent of the damage became undeniable. Neighbors who had mocked the stone fool's elaborate foundation now found themselves facing expensive repairs or complete rebuilding. "Maybe there's something to old Silas's stonework after all," admitted one settler whose own cabin showed similar moisture damage. Yet resistance to change remained strong. Tom Crenshaw, despite facing major structural repairs, insisted that the extreme conditions of 1896 were an anomaly unlikely to repeat. "One wet summer don't change what's worked for 40 years in these mountains," he maintained, even as he calculated the cost of replacing his rotted sill logs. The summer's end brought temporary relief from the rainfall, but the damage was done. Conventional foundations had failed catastrophically under conditions that McReynolds's raised stone platform had weathered without difficulty. The stage was set for an even more decisive test, one that would arrive with winter's fury and settle the question of building methods once and for all. December of 1897 brought the first warning that this winter would test every structure in the hollow beyond its designed limits. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees below zero on December 15th, colder than any recorded winter in living memory. But that was merely the prelude to what mountain folk would later call the killing winter, a season that would claim lives, destroy homes, and settle forever the question of proper mountain construction. January 2nd, 1898. The mercury in Tom Crenshaw's thermometer disappeared entirely as temperatures plunged to 23 degrees below zero, shattering the previous record of 12 below set in 1879. Snow began falling that same morning, not the gentle dusting typical of Appalachian winters, but heavy, wet flakes that accumulated at nearly 2 inches per hour. By evening, 18 inches blanketed the hollow, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Jake Tolliver's cabin, already compromised by 2 years of moisture damage, faced immediate crisis. The extreme cold created thermal bridging effects that his ground-level foundation could not resist. Heat flowed directly from his cabin's interior through the wooden sill logs into the frozen earth below, creating a thermal drain that no amount of firewood could overcome. His interior temperature dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, despite burning 2.5 cords of wood in January alone, enough fuel to last most winters. The freeze-thaw cycles proved catastrophic for conventional foundations. As temperatures swung from 23 below to brief warming periods above freezing, the saturated ground beneath ground-level cabins expanded and contracted with destructive force. Ice formation in the soil created pressures that shifted foundation stones and twisted structural members beyond their design limits. Tolliver watched helplessly as gaps opened between his logs and chinking stones worked loose from their positions. Tom Crenshaw's cabin suffered even more dramatic failure. The combination of previous moisture damage and extreme temperature stress proved too much for his compromised foundation system. On February 7th, during a particularly severe cold snap, his northeastern wall shifted visibly as frost heaving lifted and twisted his foundation stones. The structural displacement was so severe that his door would no longer close properly, allowing bitter wind to penetrate the interior. Ice dams formed along the roof lines of ground-level cabins as meltwater from brief warming periods froze against the cold walls. These dams created standing water that pooled around foundation systems, adding liquid moisture to structures already struggling with extreme cold. The combination of wet conditions and sub-freezing temperatures created ideal circumstances for structural ice formation within the wooden framework itself. The Crenshaw family evacuated their cabin on February 15th, when a section of the floor collapsed under the combined weight of snow load and structural compromise from foundation failure. 3 generations of building wisdom, Tom's 30 years of experience, and the finest materials available had proven inadequate against conditions that pushed conventional methods beyond their breaking point. 5 people sought emergency shelter with neighbors whose own cabins teetered on the edge of habitability. Dr. James Caldwell documented the health crisis during his emergency winter visits. Respiratory illnesses reached epidemic proportions in families occupying moisture-compromised cabins. The combination of extreme cold, high humidity from structural dampness, and poor air quality from desperate heating efforts created conditions that claimed the lives of 2 elderly residents and left dozens more with persistent lung ailments that would plague them for years. Meanwhile, Silas McReynolds' cabin provided a stunning contrast to the suffering around him. Interior temperatures held steady between 45 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the worst cold snaps, maintained with just 1 8/10 cords of firewood for the entire month of January. The raised stone foundation eliminated thermal bridging by creating an insulating air gap between heated space and frozen ground. No ice dams formed because proper drainage prevented water accumulation around the structure. The physics of McReynolds' superior performance were measurable and dramatic. Conventional cabins lost heat through direct contact between wooden sill logs and frozen earth, a thermal bridge that conducted warmth out of living spaces as efficiently as a metal rod. His stone foundation created thermal mass that moderated temperature swings, while the air gap provided insulation that conventional ground-level construction could not achieve. Humidity control proved equally critical during the extreme conditions. McReynolds' cabin maintained healthy interior humidity levels between 35 and 45%, while conventional structures registered dangerous saturation approaching 80%. The combination of structural dampness and extreme cold created interior conditions that supported neither human health nor structural integrity. The termite damage that had plagued ground-level cabins the previous summer now combined with freeze-thaw stress to create catastrophic structural failures. Tolliver discovered that insects had so thoroughly compromised his foundation system that frost heaving easily displaced stones and timbers that should have remained solidly positioned. The cumulative effect of biological and environmental damage had reduced his cabin's foundation to a collection of loose components held together by habit rather than structural integrity. Community resistance to McReynolds' methods finally collapsed under the weight of undeniable evidence. Neighbors who had mocked the stone fool's elaborate foundation now sought his advice on emergency repairs and reconstruction planning. "That stone shelf ain't showing off," Jake Tolliver admitted through chattering teeth as he surveyed his own cabin's damage. "It's saving lives." The crisis reached its peak in late February when 3 families found their cabins completely uninhabitable. Foundation failures, structural ice damage, and interior conditions that threatened human health had rendered conventional construction methods worse than useless. They had become actively dangerous. Emergency shelter arrangements strained the community's resources and goodwill while highlighting the stark difference between adequate preparation and true engineering excellence. As March approached, and the worst winter in Appalachian memory finally began loosening its grip, the Hollow's residents faced a choice between rebuilding using methods proven to fail or learning from the man whose excessive preparation had weathered every challenge the mountains could deliver. Spring of 1898 arrived to find half the hollow's cabins uninhabitable and their owners facing the prospect of complete reconstruction. The thaw revealed the full extent of winter's devastation: foundation stones scattered by frost heaving, sill logs rotted beyond salvage, and structural frameworks so compromised that entire buildings would need to be razed and rebuilt from scratch. Yet amid the widespread destruction, one cabin stood untouched, its occupant quietly offering shelter and technical guidance without a trace of vindication in his manner. Silas McReynolds opened his doors to the Crenshaw family first, providing temporary housing for 5 people whose own cabin had become a monument to the failure of conventional wisdom. Tom Crenshaw, the man who had dismissed the stone fool's methods as unnecessary showing off, now found himself studying every detail of the raised foundation that had weathered conditions his own expertise could not survive. The irony was not lost on either man, but McReynolds offered instruction rather than lectures, demonstrating measurements and techniques, with the patience of a teacher who understood that knowledge transferred through example rather than argument. The rebuilding began in earnest as soon as the ground thawed sufficiently for stonework. Jake Tolliver's cabin required complete demolition. The foundation damage was so extensive that no salvageable components remained. But instead of rebuilding using the same methods that had failed so catastrophically, Tolliver approached McReynolds with a request that would have seemed impossible 3 years earlier: teach me to build it right. The knowledge transfer happened with methodical precision. McReynolds shared the specifications that Heinrich Weber had drilled into him decades earlier in Lancaster County: 18-inch minimum elevation to break capillary moisture transfer, 24-inch base width tapering to 18 inches at the top for structural stability, 36-inch perimeter extension to create proper water shedding, and through stones every 4th course to bind the wall into a monolithic structure. Each measurement carried the weight of centuries of European building wisdom adapted to Appalachian conditions. Tolliver proved an eager student, hauling stone with the desperate enthusiasm of a man who had learned the cost of inadequate preparation. His new foundation required 32 tons of carefully selected fieldstone, fitted using the dry stone techniques that McReynolds demonstrated with patient repetition. The work consumed 6 weeks, but Tolliver understood now that time invested in proper foundation work would be repaid over decades of superior performance. Tom Crenshaw's reconstruction project became a community education event. His reputation as the county's master builder meant that his adoption of McReynolds' methods carried special significance. If Tom Crenshaw deemed the raised stone foundation worthy, then conventional wisdom had officially shifted. Crenshaw's new foundation incorporated every refinement that McReynolds could teach: precise stone selection for thermal mass, careful attention to drainage patterns, and structural integration that would resist both moisture infiltration and seismic movement. By summer's end, 7 new cabins in the hollow featured raised stone foundations. Local quarrying operations expanded to meet the sudden demand for building stone, as word spread through family networks across western North Carolina about the Pennsylvania immigrants' superior building methods. The technique's adoption accelerated through the practical grapevine that connected mountain communities. When people's lives depended on shelter performance, effective innovations traveled faster than gossip. Samuel McReynolds, Silas's eldest son, became the primary teacher and disseminator of his father's techniques. At 25, he combined his father's stonework knowledge with the social connections and business acumen necessary to make the methods accessible to ordinary families. Samuel understood that superior building techniques meant nothing if they remained economically impractical, so he developed efficient workflows and training systems that made raised foundations achievable within typical mountain budgets. The documented results spoke with mathematical clarity. Insurance records from the early 1900s showed that cabins built using raised stone foundations required 60 to 70% fewer major repairs than conventional ground-level structures. Dr. Sri, Caldwell's health surveys, indicated dramatic reductions in respiratory illness in communities that had adopted the improved foundation designs. The correlation between housing method and family welfare was no longer a matter of opinion, but of documented fact. Economic analysis revealed the long-term wisdom of McReynolds's approach. While raised stone foundations required greater initial investment, typically $40 to $60 more in materials and labor, they eliminated the recurring repair costs that plagued conventional construction. Families who built using the improved methods avoided the expensive cycles of foundation repair, structural reinforcement, and emergency reconstruction that characterized ground-level cabins. The technique's standardization happened organically as successful builders shared specifications and refined construction methods. By 1900, the optimal dimensions had been codified through practical experience: 18-inch minimum height for moisture protection, 24-inch base width for structural stability, extended stone shelf for water management, and through stone placement for long-term durability. These specifications became the informal building code for mountain construction throughout the region. Recognition of McReynolds's contribution came not through formal acknowledgement, but through the quiet respect accorded to men whose wisdom had saved lives. Neighbors sought his advice on all construction projects, from cabins to barns to stone bridges. His reputation evolved from object of mockery to master builder, the transformation complete when even Tom Crenshaw publicly credited him with revolutionizing mountain building practices. The legacy spread through apprentice networks as Samuel McReynolds and other trained builders carried the techniques throughout southern Appalachia. By 1920, raised stone foundations had become standard practice across the region, their superiority so thoroughly proven that few builders even remembered when ground-level construction had been considered adequate. The method survived into modern times, with contemporary mountain builders still employing variations of the design that the stone fool had perfected in 1894. In 1924, as Silas McReynolds approached his 82nd birthday, his grandson recorded the old man's reflections on the transformation he had witnessed. Wasn't about being right or proving folks wrong, was about building something that'd still be standing when the bad times came. Mountain don't care what you think is good enough, only cares what works when winter gets serious.